Morning all, and we begin with that breaking news. Novak Djokovic has had his Australian visa cancelled by the country's immigration minister. He now faces deportation. The world #1 tennis player will now not be able to play in the Australian Open, due to start on Monday. We will, of course, bring you much more on that throughout the morning. But let's go to our top story, and there is clearly much more pressure on Boris Johnson this morning, with new allegations of 2 more lockdown-breaking staff parties in Downing Street. The Daily Telegraph has reported that 2 leaving do's were held in April last year, just hours before the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral, while the country was in a period of national mourning. One staff member is reported to have been sent to the shops with a suitcase to buy alcohol. Another alleged to have broken the child's swing belonging to the Prime Minister's son. Downing Street has not denied that the parties took place. Our chief political correspondent, John Craig, has our first report.
It has been called the most poignant photo of the pandemic. The Queen mourning her beloved husband, Prince Philip, alone at his funeral at Windsor Castle during a lockdown. But the night before, the mood inside Downing Street was very different. It's claimed staff drank and danced into the early hours on April the 16th last year, the eve of the Duke's socially distanced funeral. The Daily Telegraph reports there were 2 separate leaving parties for former Director of Communications James Slack and one of Boris Johnson's personal photographers. The Prime Minister was not in Downing Street that day, according to Number 10, having left for Chequers the day before. But the latest revelations have renewed calls for his resignation. Labour's Deputy Leader Angela Rayner tweeted, "The Queen sat alone in mourning, like so many did at the time, with personal trauma and sacrifice to keep to the rules in the national interest. I have no words for the culture and behaviours at Number 10, and the buck stops with the PM." Among a series of lurid allegations about the events, the Telegraph claims excessive booze was drunk after someone was sent to the Co-op on the Strand with a suitcase to be filled with bottles of wine, and that after midnight, one Downing Street figure went on the child's swing belonging to Wilfred, the PM's son, and broke it. Downing Street has not denied the Telegraph allegations and confirmed that Mr Slack, now deputy editor of The Sun, had marked his departure with a speech. On this individual's last day, he gave a farewell speech to thank each team for the work they'd done to support him, both those who had to be in the office for work and on a screen for those working from home, a spokesperson said. More allegations, then, to add to the long list of parties being investigated by Whitehall enforcer Sue Gray. The insensitive timing of this late-night drinking is likely to appall Conservative MPs and increase the pressure on the PM in his battle for survival. John Craig, Sky News.
We can speak now to the Security Minister, Damian Hinds. Mr Hinds, very good morning.
Good morning, Neil.
We have just heard that took place the night before the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral. I'm wondering, would you, on behalf of the government, wish to apologise to the Queen this morning?
Neil, I mean, like everybody, I think, who's read this story this morning, like you as well, I was shocked. I was shocked to read it. I have only just read it. It's just out in this morning's papers, and we will have to see what comes out further in the investigation. This is a particularly sombre time, of course, for our whole country. The whole nation shared with Her Majesty in her mourning, and as was just been said in your piece there, I think one of the, everybody was so struck by that picture, the ultimate and exceptional dignity of Her Majesty at Prince Philip's funeral. We will have to see what comes out in the investigations. This will be part of the investigations taken on by Sue Gray, and we must wait to see what comes through in that.
Sure, but I mean, it clearly wasn't a sombre atmosphere inside Downing Street the night before. Again, I'll reiterate, the Prince Philip's funeral. There was a suitcase full of booze, there was music, there was dancing. Downing Street has not denied any of these details. Can you and I both just accept the fact that on the face of it, what took place that night was a party and it shouldn't have happened?
So, as I say, I'm shocked to read these allegations, and as you rightly say, particularly at that time. But it is a story that's just come out in the press this morning. I honestly don't know more about it. Clearly, I wasn't there, and I don't know. At first hand or
on the
otherwise.
Basis that Downing Street has Minister, but on the basis that Downing Street has not challenged any of the detail, on the basis that they have not challenged the detail of it, on that basis, this was a party, it shouldn't have happened.
So, look, I totally accept that if the details that are in this story turn out to be true, then that would be, clearly, people are going to form their judgment, but it will be part of these broader investigations being undertaken by Sue Gray. The terms of reference have been clear that those investigations should cover events, plural, alleged events, the nature of them, who attended them, what the purpose of them was, and I think we do need to see what comes through in that report. The Prime Minister has also been clear. The terms of reference are clear that if allegations are found to be true, if individuals appear to have been guilty of wrongdoing, then action can indeed be taken.
The line from number 10 is that the Prime Minister wasn't there. I'm just wondering in what world it matters whether or not the Prime Minister attended the events the night before the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral. We know that when he has attended those events in the past, in what we have been told repeatedly is his house, his back garden, he didn't bring it to a halt. So, given the fact that we know some incredibly senior figures in Downing Street were at this particular party, you're certainly not suggesting that there would have been an event like that if any one of them had any doubt in their mind about whether or not the Prime Minister would have approved.
So, Neil, I'm not suggesting anything. Because, look, as I said, I don't know the detail of those alleged events, or indeed more broadly, and that's why we have the investigation going on into the series of different allegations and different happenings. And I do think it's important that this story has just come out. It's just come out this morning. I think we do need to wait to see what goes on, what comes out of that report. The Prime Minister made his apology on Wednesday. I think a sincere and heartfelt apology in the context, of course, of the knowledge that all of us have of the very severe privations that the whole country has had as a result of the coronavirus restrictions. In some cases, people have been unable to mourn their loved ones or to be with them at the last. So these are incredibly important matters, and I do think it's right that the time is given for those investigations to run their proper course, and then if action needs to be taken against individuals, it can be.
Minister, I'll say something this morning that I rarely do with politicians. I've got a degree of sympathy for you. You've been the government minister that has been sent out this morning, having received an absolute hospital pass, yet again, from staff working inside number 10. I mean, Andrew, but the problem is that all of this raises questions about the Prime Minister's suitability to be Prime Minister. Andrew Bridgen, the Prime Minister's position has become untenable. Leadership is not just about the job title or even making big decisions. It is equally about having a moral compass of knowing not just right from left, but right from wrong. I mean, few, including Mr Bridgen, would have expected him to be the moral compass at the heart of the government at the moment, but he's got a point.
Well, I think leadership is incredibly important, and I am entirely behind the Prime Minister and the government, and I think the leadership that the Prime Minister has shown, particularly through the coronavirus, has been very strong. We've had the strongest vaccination programme in Europe, most tested nation.
We know all of this. We know all of this, but we are talking about a party at which a suitcase full of booze was brought in, a party at which, drunkenly or otherwise, the Prime Minister's son's swing was broken by one of those attending, dancing, drinking. It was a party. And all of this the night before the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral, the night before, when the Queen herself will have been busy preparing for one of the most solemn, sad days of her life, she sat alone in the chapel. I mean, these are all significant questions about the Prime Minister's competence, surely.
Well, as you say, this was a particularly sombre moment, and all that you say about the response, the reaction that people will have to hearing this story, I totally understand. I myself am shocked to read these allegations this morning, but I'm just not in a position to be able to comment further on them. It's not that I'm keeping something from you, Neil. I mean, I don't know because I wasn't there, and it is important that we don't just operate off a news story. That's not to diminish the importance of media, which is incredibly important, but we don't work just off
one news story,
media stories in the press.
It is a litany of news stories now.
Yes, there have been many news stories, and I think that further highlights why it's important that we're able, in a deliberative democracy, to have a senior civil servant, somebody with a great integrity and respect across the political spectrum, look at all of these things in the round, and to make an assessment in the round. Those findings then obviously will become public. And then there'll be an opportunity in Parliament. The PM's already said he will then come and make a statement. That means then, followed by questions and scrutiny from members of Parliament, and then of course scrutiny from you and your colleagues in the media. And I think it is important that that process can run its course.
Well, we await the findings of the investigation into the Prime Minister by someone appointed by the Prime Minister with great interest. I do, however, want to dwell just for a second on your brief and the revelations yesterday. That a very significant figure within the Labour Party has come perilously close to what it appears is a member of the Chinese intelligence apparatus. Are there any concerns in your mind about the probity of Barry Gardiner?
No, I mean, Neil, this isn't a story about one British politician or even one political party. This is a story, an incident, an item about how other states can seek to influence our country in different ways. One of which is political interference, and one of the ways of doing that is through provision of finance. And of course that's a concern. But, I mean, what came out yesterday, I mean, this is an example of our system working. This is our world-leading intelligence and security services discovering this and finding a way to disrupt it. So, as I say, it's an example of the system at work.
I suppose the Prime Minister, of course, under a huge amount of pressure this morning, he can at least console himself with the fact that he is not Prince Andrew. What do you make of the decision taken by Buckingham Palace to strip him of his military roles and indeed of his HRH title?
Well, these are matters for the Crown, matters for the Palace, and I know obviously matters in which they will consider exceptionally carefully. And I don't think it's right for me to comment.
Damian, Hinds, great to have you on the programme this morning. Really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Still to come on the programme this morning, we'll be getting more reaction to those most recent reports of Downing Street parties, with one Conservative MP who's already called for Boris Johnson to go. Next hour, I'll be speaking to Labour's Emily Thornberry about the latest allegations of lockdown parties at Downing Street, also Barry Gardiner. And after 9, I'll be speaking to the Lib Dem leader, Sir Ed Davey, to get his take on the ongoing party scandal. But let's get more on the breaking news you've been seeing at the bottom of your screen. Australia's immigration minister has cancelled Novak Djokovic's visa, meaning he cannot defend his Australian Open title. Let's speak now to our sports correspondent, Tom Parminter, who joins us on the programme. Good to see you this morning, Tom. Was this expected? I mean, certainly plenty of the allegations, the more lurid allegations about Novak Djokovic's behaviour over the past couple of months would have led you to perhaps expect it.
Well, certainly the polls would have suggested that the majority of the Australian public expected them to cancel the visa after all the back and forth on this. But it has taken the Australian government 96 hours after that court case that, of course, got so much attention at the start of the week, where Novak Djokovic was backed up by the judge who said, what more could this man have done? And now we, of course, know that Novak Djokovic has admitted to misleading the border authorities in Australia during the filling out the paperwork in relation to his arrival for the Australian Open. And we know that he, in all likelihood, broke the Serbian COVID rules. And that is because he tested positive on December the 16th and didn't necessarily isolate. And this is such a mess on the eve of the Australian Open. They made the draw yesterday. Novak Djokovic was in the draw, drawn against a fellow Serbian player. But we understand from Melbourne that now the decision is to kick him out and to cancel the visa. And this is the world's #1 tennis player who has been at the centre of this saga for a week now. And it is one of the most extraordinary spectacles in sport off the court of tennis, because this has just been so bitter on both sides, and it's polarised the anti-vaccination debate. And Novak Djokovic has, of course, said that he didn't get a jab because of his COVID status in December. He tested positive. We've seen the PCR certificate, but it has really become much, much bigger than that. And the majority of the Australian public, the polls suggest that they wanted him kicked out, and the immigration minister has now finally acted. There will, though, of course, in this case, be another round, because the Novak Djokovic legal team are expected to appeal in the courts in Australia. So he's not quite on the first plane back to Serbia, but it is now the Australian government who have taken their final decision, and they've said his visa's cancelled, he needs to leave Australia with just a day or two to go until the start of the Australian Open.
Tom, many thanks indeed. More breaking news now. The latest GDP figures for November have just been released. Our man in the know, our business correspondent, Paul Kelso. Good to see you this morning, Paul. So what are they telling us?
Good morning. Well, there's a little glimmer of good news for the economy in here. These are the figures for November, and GDP grew by 0.9%, forgive me, in November. But crucially, for the first time, GDP has crept above that pre-pandemic level. So it's 0.7%, the size of the economy above what it was way back in February 2019, before the pandemic hit. And that is obviously a significant moment. It does mean we've had nearly 2 years of economic decline, and the recovery from COVID and battling through COVID has been a long one, but there is a little bit of hope and some good news in there. Services helped lead the increases in November, up 0.7%, production up a hair, 0.1%, and construction 3.5% up. The chief economist of the Office for National Statistics, which manages these numbers, says the economy grew strongly in the month before Omicron struck, with architects, retailers, couriers and accountants having a bumper month. I think the key word in that statement, of course, is Omicron. These are the numbers for November. And at the very end of that month, we first heard news of the new variant from South Africa. I remember being out in the West End on Black Friday, that bumper day for retailers pre-Christmas, the very end of November. It was the morning after the South African authorities had given us details of the new variant. I remember thinking, surely we'll never put all this energy, this huge presence of shoppers and spending and the return of the economy, that will never be squeezed back in the bottle. Of course, within days and weeks, it was. December was a desperate month for hospitality and retail. So we wait to see what the impact of Omicron is on that. Otherwise, good news as the economy looked at the end of November, back above pre-COVID levels.
Paul, many thanks indeed. Now, Ukraine's foreign ministry has confirmed a massive cyber attack has hit several government websites. Let's speak now to our defence and security editor, Deborah Hinds, who's in Kiev for us this morning. Good to see you, Deborah. Do we know exactly who's responsible? I mean, I've got a few guesses.
Yes, well, there's obviously one prime suspect that's on people's minds. I did actually ask the Foreign Ministry spokesperson if anyone was suspected in the attack, and he said to me, it's too early to draw conclusions, but there is a long record of Russian assaults against Ukraine. And yes, we woke up this morning to find that a number of government websites were temporarily down. In fact, the website of the Foreign Ministry, before it went down, was displaying a warning saying that all your information has become public and be afraid and expect worse. Clearly now there's an investigation underway. The Foreign Ministry spokesperson that I mentioned said that specialists are working on restoring the IT systems, and the cyber police are investigating what's happened. But this attack comes at a time of extreme tension over Ukraine. You've had a week of diplomacy between Russia, the United States, NATO allies and wider European partners about security in Europe and principally security here in Ukraine, with real concerns that there is a risk of a further Russian physical invasion. And you'll remember that when Russia annexed Crimea back in 2014 and backed an insurgency in the east of the country, there were multiple cyber attacks against critical infrastructure in Ukraine as well as part of that assault. And Russia has always been blamed for those attacks. And one of the things that people have been looking for as an indication of where this tensions, this conflict could be going, is potentially new cyber attacks. And so while we haven't had confirmation as to who caused the cyber attacks on the websites today, clearly it's a very concerning sign at a time when tensions are so high.
Certainly is. Deborah, thank you. Let's take a quick look at some of the day's other headlines now. And a parliamentary report has recommended that public funding for cricket should depend on continuous demonstrable progress in getting rid of racism. Azim Rafiq gave emotional testimony last year about the racism he experienced at Yorkshire County Cricket Club. Mr Rafiq himself later apologised after it emerged that he had used anti-Semitic slurs on social media in 2011. NHS leaders are warning that it is wishful thinking to believe the threat from Omicron is over. The chief executive of the NHS Confederation said the national data on reported cases offered some hope, but there was still pressure on the health service with high levels of staff absence. Welsh First Minister Mark Drakeford will today set out plans to ease COVID restrictions over the next 2 weeks. Limits on large outdoor gatherings in Wales are likely to be the first to be removed. A suspect in the murder inquiry into the death of a teacher in Tullamore in County Offaly in Ireland has been released. Irish police said the 40-year-old man was no longer suspected of killing 23-year-old Aisling Murphy, who was attacked on the banks of the Grand Canal. The woman accusing Prince Andrew of sexual assault says she will continue to expose the truth. Virginia Giuffre tweeted saying that she is happy that her case against the Prince wasn't dismissed in court. Ms Giuffre said this: "I'm pleased with Judge Kaplan's ruling yesterday that allows my case against Prince Andrew to go forward." She continued, "I'm glad I will have the chance to continue to expose the truth, and I'm deeply grateful to my extraordinary legal team. Their determination helps me seek justice from those who hurt me and so many others. My goal has always been to show that the rich and powerful are not above the law and must be held accountable. I do not walk this path alone, but alongside countless other survivors of sexual abuse and trafficking." Well, as Prince Andrew prepares for a potential civil trial over those sexual assault allegations, he has been stripped of all his honorary military roles and royal patronages. He can no longer use his Royal Highness and will no longer perform any public duties. The announcement came from Buckingham Palace, which made clear the decision had been widely discussed within the royal family. Joining us on the programme, our royal commentator, Alistair Bruce. Alistair, always good to see you, but I suspect on a morning such as this, you will have mixed emotions. I mean, just your response to the decisions taken by, we must assume, the Queen in stripping Prince Andrew of those military patronages and indeed the title.
The Queen has been entirely resolute here. She understands that the monarchy exists by the will of the United Kingdom, and that it is expected to deliver the highest forms of probity. And at a time when the Duke of York was facing these charges, and after the judge had decided that they would be answered in court, it was very sensible of the Queen to make the quick and immediate decision that she has made and to withdraw all those patronages and military ranks from the Duke of York.
You saw no alternative to that, Alistair?
Well, I don't think I did, actually. No, I think it was probably very helpful that it happened so immediately. And that makes sure that the Duke is clear to get on with defending himself. He holds very vehemently to being innocent of the charges against him. But it would have been absolutely impossible for this very difficult case to proceed while he was still taking part in royal events as part of the Queen's family during this Platinum Jubilee year.
We know, of course, that the Duke is proud, and justly so, of his own military service. One then assumes that those military patronages will have been very close to his heart. One wonders how he will be feeling having had this decision made for him.
Well, the Duke and I and many others served in the Falklands War. And we were all military people. We served the Queen. We did our duty. And military people understand that the highest standards are expected. And if at any stage your life puts you into a situation where you might bring a note of discord to the reputation of the regiment or the organisation you serve with, which is made up of a number of soldiers, sailors, airmen and women who are doing their best to serve to the highest standards, then you step back. And so this is the ideal way of making sure that the Duke, who has been serving the Queen in whatever way he could, is now stepped away from all military roles and then all the civilian charities that he has been involved with. But the Queen has taken all those roles onto herself and will redistribute them. And for the Queen, then, she can concentrate with the working members of her family in representing her responsibilities as head of state of 15 nations.
Alistair, just in practical terms, how does the Queen remove the HRH, remove those patronages? Is there a vellum document somewhere that needs to be signed and sealed? No, there isn't. It is, the way it's done is she is the fountain of all honour in the United Kingdom, according to the Constitution. And so at her will, she can do that which she wishes, particularly with the royal family. But at the same time, there are other processes that can be taken. And, if there is a need to do any more or less in the future, the Queen can equally easily do that. But she is Queen, and these are issues that sit within the royal prerogative. And dealing with members of the royal family and making sure that the royal family is there to serve her role as head of state is her principal concern. She inherited the monarchy from King George VI in 1952, very nearly 70 years ago. And she got from him the highest standards when he was the figurehead during the Second World War, when the United Kingdom faced great difficulties. We are in great difficulties again. Her Commonwealth faces all sorts of challenges through COVID in different degrees in different nations. And this is a chance in her Platinum Jubilee to mark those 70 years of service. And the Duke of York's case simply had to be set to one side from that. And that is why she acted decisively yesterday. Alistair, always lovely to see you. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. Just a little bit of breaking news, and this again relates to those parties plural, two of them, of course, taking place on the same night, the night before the Prince Philip's funeral. We've been hearing from one of those who was involved in the party, the Prime Minister's former Director of Communications, James Slack. He has said that he wants to apologise unreservedly for the anger and hurt caused by that party held to mark his leaving Downing Street. He said it should not have happened at the time that it did. James Slack able to provide an apology this morning. Unfortunately, the government minister not so. Time for us to have a quick check and see how the weather's looking.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Today brings some sunshine once the morning fog lifts, but cloud will be more extensive over the weekend. The south will start frosty, with dense freezing fog patches giving some tricky conditions, but the north will be milder. Central and southern England looking most at risk of travel disruption. The fog will slowly lift during the morning to leave plenty of sunshine in the south, but it might linger in a few spots across the Welsh Marches.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Just a reminder as to our top stories this morning. More pressure on the Prime Minister with reports that 2 COVID rule-breaking staff parties were held at number 10 the night before Prince Philip's funeral. Novak Djokovic's Australian visa is cancelled by the country's immigration minister. The world number 1 now faces deportation and will thus no longer play in the Australian Open next week. New figures show gross domestic product rose by 0.9% during November, pushing above pre-pandemic levels for the first time. But a little more on those Downing Street parties now. The Security Minister, Damian Hinds, says he's shocked about those allegations that came to light late last night. The government minister told me earlier he understands why people will feel angry reading those reports.
This was a particularly sombre moment, and all that you say about the response, the reaction that people will have to hearing this story, I totally understand. I myself am shocked to read these allegations this morning, but I'm just not in a position to be able to comment further on them. It's not that I'm keeping something from you, Neil. I mean, I don't know because I wasn't there, and it is important that we don't just operate off a news story.
To try and make sense of it all, let's bring in our political correspondent, Rob Powell. And you've almost got as thankless a task as poor Damian Hinds this morning. I mean, we have now had an apology, of course, but not from someone who is currently employed by Downing Street.
Yeah, very significant. We've had a statement in the last few minutes from James Slack, who used to be the Director of Communications under Boris Johnson, worked under Theresa May as well, where he has apologised. But what's significant is that he has also apparently in this statement confirmed that a party did take place. He said that he apologises unreservedly for the anger and hurt caused by a party held to mark his leaving Downing Street in April 2021, which he said should not have happened at the time it did. So that's someone on the record that we know worked in Downing Street at the time, a credible voice that was there, an eyewitness saying that this was a party that took place and it shouldn't have happened as well. So I think this puts this onto another level now. For the Prime Minister, I think the case for the defence will clearly be that he was not there. Number 10 saying, confirming this morning that he was at Chequers, his residence on the outskirts of London on that day. What makes it damaging, though, I think, are really the extraordinary details in this Telegraph story. The suitcase full of booze coming back from the co-op.
Which apparently had been deployed by successive governments.
Yeah, an advisor from the coalition years says that the suitcase had been a kind of... familiar sight around Number 10 for years now. But the fact of that, DJing on top of photocopying machines in the basement, I think when you contrast that with what happened hours later of the Queen sitting on her own, mourning her husband at his funeral, I think that is what will really anger a lot of Tory MPs and a lot of members of the public, potentially even some that until now may have been minded to cut Boris Johnson some slack.
Give you a choice of words. Thanks very much. Well, the NHS has launched a new advertising campaign to encourage 18 to 34-year-olds to get their COVID booster jabs, with uptake among young people lower than other age groups, pleased to say. Joining us now, A&E doctor Kishan Badalia. He works on the front line in the A&E. You might also recognise him from his NH Sessions DJing. How are you doing this morning? Good to see you, doctor.
Thank you for having me.
Explain why, in your mind, do you think quite so few people eligible for the booster have actually taken up in that particular age cohort of concern?
So that's right. Just over half the people between the ages of 18 and 30 who are eligible for their boosters have actually taken them. And this number is far too low, so we have to keep encouraging them. There are a number of reasons why people aren't taking up the boosters or even the primary course of the vaccine. This could be a perceived lack of convenience where people think it's not easy to get a vaccine, when in fact it is very easy. You can book in online, nhs.uk/COVID vaccination. There's been concerns regarding side effects where now, as a doctor, I can reassure any young people watching this that side effects tend to be very, very mild. You might have a slight headache or an achy arm, and simple painkillers like paracetamol could help. But also, I think possibly the way we are educating people, we need to make sure we get information to young people in the right format. So it's brilliant to see that the NHS and government have teamed up with Snapchat on a new filter to get the information to the right people.
I will ask you a little bit more about that in just a second, Doctor, but just in terms of why young people might not have taken up these boosters. I mean, in terms of hospitalisations and serious hospitalisations, those requiring intensive care, young people are not filling the wards up at the moment, are they?
Well, we are seeing more young people coming into hospital. In my experience, I'm seeing more young unvaccinated people rather than those who've been fully vaccinated. Those who are unvaccinated are 8 times more likely to be hospitalised than those who have been fully vaccinated. And that is actually my experience at the moment.
So tell us then about the campaign and this Snapchat filter. I am vaguely aware of what Snapchat is. I think colleagues in the gallery here at Sky News have often held their phone up to put a cat's face on me in the past. But this is slightly different. Explain how this is going to convince them to get the jag.
So Snapchat is a leading social media platform used by young people. When I was growing up, I
do know
Snapchat.
that. I was only joking, Doctor, right?
and I'm still using Snapchat myself. And basically, it's a way that people can apply a filter to photos or videos that they put on their Snapchat profiles for their viewers and their friends and their family to see. So by putting a filter that says, "I've been boosted," means that all their followers can also see this and they can click the link to book in for their own boosters.
Yeah, honestly, I'm not quite as old as I may well appear, but that's thanks to lots of makeup. Doctor, we're going to have to leave it there, but we do wish you very, very well with the campaign. Certainly something we want to see going forward. Dr. Cushing-Badalia, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, it started at 14 days, then it went down to 10, then 7. Now, those who test positive for COVID in England can leave isolation after just 5 days, if that is, they record 2 negative LF tests on days 5 and 6. But the decision to further ease the rules has drawn some criticism after the UK Health Security Agency data released earlier this week found that almost a third of those with COVID remain infectious after 5 days. Well, let's get the thoughts now of Professor Azim Majid, the head of Imperial College London's Department of Primary Care and Public Health. Professor, great to have you on the programme this morning. How sanguine are you about the reduction to 5 days, given those exit tests?
Good morning. I think it's a pragmatic approach. We have seen very high infection rates in recent weeks, which has affected many parts of the economy, the NHS, hospitality, public transport, for example, teaching. So I think bringing down the period to 5 days is helpful. But as you mentioned, it does require a negative test on day 5 and day 6. Also, it's very important that you have no symptoms or very mild symptoms. So, for example, you have a high temperature or a bad cough, then you should carry on isolating, even if your tests are negative. So I think it's reasonably positive, but has to be delivered with some caution, particularly if you have symptoms.
Yeah, just on that point, the idea that so many people could still be in a position to infect others even at that kind of 5-day point. Is it guaranteed that if they are still infectious, that would register on a lateral flow test?
No, there's no guarantees. Probably around 7% of people may remain infectious, even with a negative lateral flow test after 5 days. But that's similar to the proportion of being not infectious around 10 days, which is around 5 or 6%. So by bringing it down to 5 days, but requiring 2 negative lateral flow tests and also an improvement in symptoms, it's similar in its effect to having a 10-day isolation period.
Just in terms of the testing itself, do you believe that we have the capacity to make sure that the 5-day isolation period can work?
We need to make sure people can get the tests. So very important those tests are then prioritised for groups that need them, such as those who are following guidance from Test and Trace or key workers. There was a shortage over Christmas, unfortunately, but it does look like that is now abating. And that may have been driven by people wanting to socialise with their families. It does seem that supply of tests is now once again improving across the UK.
Professor, in your mind, should the rules be different for those who work directly with, for example, the clinically vulnerable?
Yes, in my view, they should be. The government has not yet clarified the approach for NHS staff or people in care homes, but in my view, people who work with people who are vulnerable, such as the elderly or those with medical problems, should have probably some additional measures in place to ensure they don't affect people who may then suffer adverse effects from an infection.
Professor Azim Majid, great to have you on the programme this morning. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
There is more pressure on the Prime Minister this morning after fresh revelations about parties in Downing Street. A report in today's Telegraph suggests that staff held not one, but 2 leaving parties on the eve of Prince Philip's funeral in April of last year. Joining us now, the Conservative MP, Sir Roger Gale, who has already submitted a letter of no confidence in the Prime Minister. Sir Roger, good to see you this morning. I don't know whether you caught the story last night or this morning, like the Government Minister Damian Hinds doing the rounds. You will have, however, by now have heard about it. What do you make of what happened inside Number 10 on the eve of the Queen's husband's funeral? Sir Roger, I believe you may well have yourself on mute. If you hit the button, we can try again. Don't worry, I've got people who do all this stuff for me, so please don't worry about it. There we go. Sir Roger, let's start again, shall we? Good to see you again. Just your reaction to that which we are learning about what happened in April 2021.
I think the events that took place on that evening were wholly unacceptable and completely insensitive and should never have happened. But that said, I don't hold the Prime Minister personally responsible for those because patently the Prime Minister was not there. But it does reveal, I think, a culture within Downing Street that obviously stems from the top and should not be permitted.
Do you think, of course, as mentioned, you've submitted your letter to the 22 committee. I wonder whether the revelations of last night might serve to focus the minds of certain of your colleagues?
Of themselves, I would doubt it because the Prime Minister was not present. It is just another event in a chapter of incidents that should not have happened. But I do think that minds are now, over this weekend, being focused upon the need to take the necessary action. I clearly, Neil, don't know, and I shouldn't know, how many of my colleagues have put in letters. I'm not canvassing them. I'm not seeking support for what I have done myself. But I believe that there is a momentum that is growing.
Yeah, I mean, you must have had communications from constituents, perhaps not necessarily related to the story, the individual story that came out last night, but about the culture, it appears, of drinking within Number 10 during periods of lockdown. I mean, is there not a real risk that the Conservative Party is going to lose vast swathes of faithful followers simply because of continued fealty to Boris Johnson?
Well, I don't think that the image of the Downing Street branch of the Majestic Wine Warehouse is doing us any good at all. That clearly has to end. But it's much more important and much more serious than that, Neil. This goes back. I voted against the government on the Internal Markets Bill because I believe that it was quite wrong for a British government to seek to unilaterally break a freely entered into international treaty. You know, there are serious political issues about our standing in the world that have to be addressed. And I'm afraid those issues lay straight at the doorstep of the Prime Minister.
Given that, do we need to wait for the report of Sue Gray to work out whether or not there is any longevity to Boris Johnson's political future? I mean, does it matter now whether or not these events were technically within the rules, given the public opprobrium?
I would expect that Sue Gray, as a responsible civil servant, will produce a wholly factual report without recommendations. She will say what has happened, and it will be up to the rest of us to decide what then should happen. But of course, in a sense, we know, because the Prime Minister told us from the dispatch box on Wednesday what happened. And that's why, having said I would wait for the report from Sue Gray, I went public on Wednesday lunchtime after Prime Minister's question time, because I believe that what was revealed was completely unacceptable.
Do you believe that the Metropolitan Police should be involved in some form, that there should be an investigation, perhaps even just specifically on the events of the eve of the royal funeral?
That's a matter entirely for the Metropolitan Police. It's an extremely long time since I held a police warrant, and my law is a bit rusty, and I'm not going to try and presume to tell the Met what to do. If they feel that there is a matter, if they feel that laws have been broken and that it is necessary to investigate, then I'm quite sure that they will do that. The only problem with that, of course, is that while we are waiting for Sue Gray's report, if the Met then become involved before that report is published, that will then go on ice and it will merely prolong the entire process.
Critical voices like yours have been accused of being, in a sense, the usual suspects. Nadine Dorris saying yesterday, colleagues like yourself had a track record of not supporting the Prime Minister. How fair or unfair do you think that characterisation is?
I have been described as a serial critic of the Prime Minister. In a sense, that's true. My criticism, my letter calling for a leadership election goes back to the Barnard Castle event, when the Prime Minister failed to take what I regarded as appropriate decisions and action to remove Mr. Cummings from office, because what happened then was quite wrong. And I decided then that if the Prime Minister was not capable of exercising the right kind of judgment, then we had to have another Prime Minister. So yes, I mean, my track record does go back a long way. But all I'd say, Neil, is I have been consistent. I'm not, and I've also tried to be fair. I mean, to be fair, the Prime Minister has achieved some significant results. He's whether I like it or not doesn't matter. He's delivered on Brexit as he promised he was going to. After a bumpy start, he's presided over the best world-beating vaccination program that saved thousands of lives. You can't take that away from him. The problem is that the man's judgment is flawed.
Sir Roger, I'm afraid we will have to leave it there. Sir Roger Gale, good to have you on the programme this morning. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, let's just remind you as to the bit of breaking news in the past few minutes. One of those who attended what we now know to be parties inside Downing Street on the eve of Prince Philip's funeral, James Slack, the former Director of Communications for the Prime Minister. It was his leaving do that night. He's issued a statement in which he says he wants to apologise unreservedly for the anger and the hurt caused by that party in April 2021. He said it should not have happened at the time that it did.